Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy, and welcome back to me, talking about books. It's Pride Month, everyone, and we all know what that means. I have to talk about some ace representation. The ace-coded Shakespeare shirt is making a return, in case you haven't seen this one yet. So this is a quote from Hamlet, and it says, "Men delights not me, nor woman neither." So perfect t-shirt, I would argue. So for those who are not familiar, I'm an ace demi-romantic guy. I love me some ace representation, which is not a lot, unfortunately, in media. So I have made a couple of videos on ace representation before. I will link them here, down there, somewhere, where I mostly talked about ace characters in media, mostly movies and TV shows, but also some books and some other related media. But I really wanted to focus this time on books, popular books within the ace bubble. So today I've chosen 3 books for you that are more or less well known in regards to talking about asexuality, and today I would like to review them in a way that's all about, how's the ace rep, what kind of ace characters do we encounter in these books, how is asexuality and potentially also aromanticism portrayed in these books. Do we learn anything? Are those good or bad representations? Do we learn anything as someone who is maybe not familiar really with asexuality, or is there something new for people who are already familiar with asexuality? All that. So today I'm going to talk about these 3 books. So I chose 3 books from 3 different genres or 3 different categories, so we have a bit of variety to talk about. So we have the arguably most popular, most well-known book about asexuality in the fictional realm, I would argue, namely Loveless by Alice Oseman. I have spoken a bit about this book before in one of my videos where I talked about ace rap, if you've already seen that. So today I would like to go a bit more into detail in regards to my thoughts on this book. Then we have something for the manga and comic book readers out there. We are going to talk about the manga Is Love the Answer, which is an aro ace coming of age story about a young woman. And then we also have something for the non-fiction fans out there, namely Ace, what asexuality reveals about desire, society, and the meaning of sex. I'm going to try and be as spoiler-free as possible when I talk about these books, especially with the ones that are more in the fictional realm. I'm gonna give my thoughts and opinions on the overall books, just going by the stories and the characters, but the major focus of this is what's the ace rep in these books, and is it any good? So let's start this video and let's dive into the most recent one I've read out of these 3. Let's start with Is Love the Answer. So Is Love the Answer is a relatively new manga about a young girl called Chika, and she is now in a phase of her life where she's trying to figure herself out. She's attending college, she's attending university, she's sort of trying to date for the first time, but also realizes that she's not really into that. And now with this new phase of her life up ahead, she's trying to figure out who she really is, what she really wants. So did I enjoy this manga? Overall, yes. I was a big fan of this one. I'm a manga reader in general, so I was excited to finally get a manga that was specifically just about ace representation, because I do read other queer manga series, but I've never really encountered a manga that was specifically about asexuality. So I was really happy to discover this. The art style in general, I think, is very cute, very sweet, nothing to write home about, but I think it does what it's supposed to do. Don't be surprised. This is a German copy of this manga because I live in Germany, but I also have an English copy of this. So here's just a quick look at the general art style for this manga. Like nothing too fancy, nothing too out there, but honestly, it looks great. Like the character design, I think, is the most important aspect of this manga, and it works really well because it incorporates like some different aspects of like all these characters that we meet in the manga. Like some of the personalities are reflected within their character design as well. But let's dive a bit deeper into this. So this manga is a Arrow Ace coming out story for Chika, for this young girl. And this is very much, I think, a good introductory story for asexuality, for like the theme of asexuality, because we are basically finding out about asexuality alongside this character. So this manga doesn't really have like an overall like plot, so to speak. There isn't like a goal, specific goal this character is trying to reach. We're really just like following her going about her day as she is trying to figure herself out. And she's figuring herself out by like it starts out with her like dating a boyfriend for the first time, but then realizing that once the boyfriend wants to get physical, she doesn't want that at all. She's not enjoying it. She's not in general really into the idea of dating anyone, and she's worried about that this might be weird, that she might never fall in love, that people might think she's broken. And of course there are like those moments where, you know, some of her other girlfriends are trying to like find boys for her to date, and she sort of tries it, but then at the end of the day always realizes that she doesn't want this. Like she doesn't want this kind of classic romantic life that all her girlfriends have in mind for her. And then she starts studying, she meets a group of new people, and as she's like figuring herself out, she's also trying to be a bit more open about, like talk to people about it. But then some of her new friends are very much not open to the idea. Like they sort of come up with like some of the classic lines of that, well, have you tried therapy? You sure you're not broken? Are you sure you haven't just met the right person yet? You know, those kinds of things. So she becomes somewhat discouraged, but then finds comfort in one of her university professors, who, as we learn later, they are also ace and also queer in some other ways. And she loves talking to this professor, and in this professor they talk a lot about, you know, identity and sexuality in the society, very much that's filled with sex connotated things. So that professor is a sort of like a mentor figure to Chika as she's trying to figure herself out. And then she finds, among her new friend group, she actually finds two people who do not agree with like those ace-phobic things, and they are actually also queer, trying to figure themselves out. So these three sort of like start forming a new friendship group, and then they all three of them kind of just like hang out, trying to figure themselves out. They talk about life, they talk about sexuality, about gender identity, about their relationships, and our protagonist, she is like opening up to them more and more and more, and together they're sort of like figuring out who they are, who she is specifically. And she also bonds with like some unlikely characters who she met in the beginning of the story, where she thought she couldn't really connect with them at all, but then she realized, oh no, we're actually bonding over something. And then she realized, oh, there are actually more ace people out there, and this is not an uncommon occurrence. So honestly, this was really sweet. Like this is a great, I think, coming out story for an Arrow Ace character. The only flaw or issue I really have with this manga is that it does sometimes read a little bit like a Wikipedia article, like because the main character is doing a lot of research herself, and a bunch of stuff is also being explained to her by people who are already out as Ace or as Arrow. So they're explaining a lot of like terminology and stuff like that to her. So there are times when this really is just like a wall of information. We're just getting a bunch of like phrases and terms just like thrown at us as the reader, which I guess makes sense from a narrative standpoint, because we are finding out about this stuff alongside her while she's doing this research. But it is a bit too much at times. Like sometimes it really just feels like you're reading like an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary or something. Like that's what it feels like at times, but I guess it's fine. And I mean, I guess that's sort of also what you expect a little bit when it comes to like a coming out story. And what I like is that while this is mostly focused on um, sexuality and romantic identity as well, I like that they also sprinkle in some like gender identity discussion in there as well. Because, for example, there is like this moment where she's like trying to figure herself out, and she finds like a questionnaire she's filling out about sex and gender, and she's like marking up how interested she is in like sex and romance, and then what her gender identity is. And I like that then it comes up that she feels mostly like a girl, but not all the time. And we see that she marks herself as like somewhere between female and non-binary. So I love that that comes up. It's not a major focus, but it's something that gets addressed. And I love that that's just out there. And that there are also other characters we meet within the manga who are either also ace or also arrow, or other people who are trying to figure out their own sexuality. Like one of her friends she's meeting, he's sort of like in the process of figuring out is that he might be bisexual or that he might be gay. Like he's sort of like figuring that out. There's some characters who are like, well, I also love that there's a couple in this that lives together, that is married, but they're not really a couple, like as we know. They're not a classic married couple, but it's like a platonic, queer platonic relationship, and they're married and they're happy in that situation, but they're not like having sex, they're not like holding hands, making kissy faces, they're not out there to go on dates or stuff like that, but they are having a good marriage. They figured themselves out and they're happy with where they are and with who they are. And I love that. There are many like different personalities and different identities being shown in this manga. Like it's shown that there's a rainbow of people, as we know, out there, and I love that it focuses on that. And while it does majorly, like, of course, concern itself with what is asexuality, what is aromanticism, I love that it also like highlights that there are other identities out there, that asexuality itself is also very much a spectrum, that some ace people are asexual but still want romantic relationships, that there are people who are not asexual but are aromantic. So it's definitely shown here that there are different identities within the like ace umbrella, which I like a lot. So honestly, really love this manga. I think this is like a solid like introduction into asexuality as a theme, if you yourself are maybe trying to figure yourself out, or if you're like trying to find like asexuality rep in fiction, and you sort of want to get started with not too heavy themes, and maybe want to learn some basic terminology at first as well. I think this is like a really good start, and I had a lot of fun with this manga. Next up, let's talk some non-fiction. Let's talk about this book by Angela Chen. It has a quite long title. So it's called Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex. So I've been trying to read more non-fiction, because non-fiction is usually a genre book of books that I don't really read that much, to be honest. But ever since I've gotten more into like biographies and stuff like that, I've been trying to read more non-fiction about other topics as well, topics that interest me and are relatable to me. So I picked up this book that I found at my local bookshop, and I had heard of this book before. I heard mostly good things about it, so I was like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna check it out. I want to learn more about my own sexuality. So this is a book written by Angela Chen, and she basically covers some general ideas about asexuality, but mostly also about what it means to be asexual nowadays, like especially in a world that's very much filled with sex connotated things, how aces live in this world, what kind of different ace identities there are. Like this book really dives into how different people experience asexuality in all like ways, shapes, and forms that you could possibly imagine. And then goes into mostly like the socio-political aspect of what it means to be ace nowadays. So I thought this book was really, really interesting. What I appreciated a lot about this book was that it tries to cover or include many different experiences from across like the ACE umbrella. So this book relies a lot on like interviews the author has conducted with like people from the ACE spectrum, and then sort of like highlighting their experiences being ACE, or and connected with the specific cultural background they might have, and then how they sort of like live their ACE identity and how it works for them, what kind of encounters and experiences they've had throughout their life. And then the author combines those experiences with like an academic background, giving us some dates, giving us some data, giving us some like socio-economic or socio-political background, some historical background on certain things. So I really love like the different facets of people that we see in this book, because I really appreciate this book showed me identities that I hadn't even really considered before. So this is what I just have to call myself out. I'm a white person and I'm able-bodied, and this book includes also a lot of people who are POC, who are not able-bodied, and those were experiences that I have to be honest, I hadn't really thought about before. They hadn't really considered yet, because they hadn't really come up to me yet, because I'm not that person, and I hadn't really taken the time to think about those identities. So it was really interesting to, for example, read about the experiences of like people who are ACE and also POC, that there are a lot of expectations put on people of color or Latinx people, because there are those cliches, for example, stereotypes that POC people are supposed to be like very passionate and into sex, like sort of this positive kind of racism, and that they sort of live with that they are ACE, but it's expected of them to be into sex because they are not white. So that's something, for example, I hadn't really thought about. The same goes for like disabled people that are spoken about here, like because there is this cliche or stereotype or prejudice that disabled people can't really be like sexy or can't be sexual in any way, shape, or form. And of course that's not the case, but then there are also, of course, naturally like disabled ACE people who then don't want to give into this prejudice. They have this fear of, oh, I'm disabled but also not into sex. Am I therefore like giving into the prejudice? Am I therefore giving into the cliche that a lot of people already believe about disabled people? So they're sort of fighting with that perception they're having, which I thought was really interesting as well. So those are like just some aspects that this book considers and talks about that I myself hadn't thought about before. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I also love that there are like just like the general focus on not just the different identities, but also just like how society works for an ACE person, especially also like from a perception, from a language point of view, because essentially what I really like is that this book tried to explain is that for us, like for ACE people, we're essentially trying to explain ourselves with something that doesn't exist. So we have language for what sex is, what sexual attraction is, but we're trying to use this language to explain that we're not feeling that. So we don't really have a language to explain the lack of the thing that does have language. So I don't know, that was, for example, an interesting aspect, that we are living in this world that is so entrenched by sex-connotated things. Sex is expected to be a natural part of everyone's existence. And then you're living, as an ACE person, you're living in this world and you're just trying to explain to people why this thing that's to many people seems so natural, so inherent, does not exist for us. It doesn't really concern us. And it's really hard to explain the lack of a thing that's just generally assumed to exist for everyone around the world. So that was really interesting to get into. The only thing that I would argue that I was missing in this book was any discussion about ace representation. Ace representation does get mentioned, but only for like not even 5 pages. And then it really only mentions like the big ones. So we get like this, so we get the obligatory mention of Todd from BoJack Horseman. I was really looking forward to that because I thought like Todd, for many, me included, is like the great ace representation. Like Todd Chavez from BoJack Horseman for a long time was the only ace character we had, and for a long time up until now, arguably, it's like the great ace coming out and ace representation that we have. And he's talked about for like one paragraph, not even one page in this book. Then we get like the obligatory mention of that one Dr. House episode where House tries to convince someone that asexuality is not real and that if you don't have a desire to have sex, something must be medically wrong with you, which it then turned out to be the case in that episode. That gets talked about. And that's sort of it. Like there are 1 or 2 other characters mentioned, like from a 90s show and one more recent one, but they all just get talked about for like maybe a page and that's it. And like like ace rep doesn't even make up a chapter in this. Like combined, ace rep makes up maybe 5 to 6 pages. Which was really sad because I was looking forward to that. I'm like, why are we not talking about more ace? Because there are clearly famous characters who are widely assumed to be ace or who are widely sort of respected within the ace community to be ace. Not just characters like Todd, but also the characters who are usually headcanon to be ace, like Sherlock Holmes or Spock and Data from Star Trek or Seven of Nine. Like characters like that, and they don't get mentioned at all in this book. And it doesn't even get talked about, how it only gets like basically briefly mentioned that, ace representation barely exists in the media, which is sad. And that's sort of it. Like, couldn't you have gone a bit deeper into that? Like, there is more stuff out there. You could talk about book characters. You could talk about, characters that are generally assumed to be ace. None of that. So in terms of just like ace representation as a theme, that was really lacking in this book. That was honestly the only thing I was really, really missing in this book. Because otherwise, this is really interesting. Honestly, there's so many aspects discussed in this book that I mean, you can see it here. I taped like a lot of stuff that I thought was really, really interesting, just about, generally how relationships work, how society views sex or a sexless person. I also really liked the talk about sexual relationships, like aces who do have sex, and this idea of consent, that for ace people, sex and consent work slightly differently. So for example, just one thing that, because it's the last thing I taped in this book, which I thought was really interesting, is that this book talks about a structure for consent that the researcher Emily Nagoski came up with. And that author, they basically suggest like using categories when we talk about consent. So there's like enthusiastic consent, which means, I want you, I don't feel consequences of saying yes or saying no. And when saying no means I'm missing out on something I want. And then there's like willing consent, which is about I care about you, though I don't desire you right now. I'm pretty sure saying yes will have an okay result, and I believe that desire may begin after I say yes. And then there's also like unwilling consent, which is then all about, I fear the consequences of saying no more than I fear the consequences of saying yes. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we have coerced consent, which is all about, you threaten me with harmful consequences if I say no to sex. So I thought this was like one aspect I thought was really, really interesting, this whole talk about sex and consent, because I think a lot of people can't really wrap their heads around this idea of, just because a person is ace doesn't mean they don't have sex or are intimate in any way, shape, or form with their partners. That was like an aspect I really appreciated that this book talked about. And I honestly think You will learn some things here. Like, I learned some new things as an ace person, and I think you will get something out of this. If you're ace, if you're not ace, if you're just like trying to like figure stuff out for yourself, if you're just trying to learn some things about asexuality or queer history, I honestly think this is a good start if you're like looking for a non-fiction book. It's well written. It has a lot of like data as well, like academic data and proof as well to back up some of the details and explanations are being given. It includes a lot of like different voices from different people across the ace spectrum. So yeah, if you're looking for like a good non-fiction book that talks about mainly like socio-political aspects of being ace, this is a good one. And last, but by no means least, I would like to talk about Loveless by Alice Oseman. Now, it's been a while since I've read this book, so some details might still be a bit hazy to me. But I would still like to talk about this book because I think this is the one book that will probably come up if you talk about, you know, popular ace rap books by famous authors or something. This will probably come up. So Alice Oseman, you're probably gonna know her, is the creator of Heartstopper, of that series, which you also might know from Netflix. I've read Radio Silence from her as well, which came out before this. So this was the second book of hers that I read, but I haven't read, but I've watched the Heartstopper TV series, which is great. You should watch it. Wholesome queer content. So this book, I, at the time, was very excited to read because at the time I hadn't really read a lot of ace rap in books. So I was really excited to get into this because, you know, this is just a book entirely about asexuality, about an aro ace main character who's trying to figure herself out, trying to figure out what the hell this whole ace business is. So this book is about Georgia, and Georgia is starting her first year at university, and she's trying to figure herself out because she realizes she isn't really into romance. She doesn't really like the idea of kissing or having sex, and she's trying to figure out what that means. She has two friends who are joining her at university, who she like occasionally hangs out with. One of her friends, her best friend, is a lesbian girl who she talks to a lot, and then her other friend is like a guy who has sort of a crush on her, as she figures out. And then she also makes a new friend named Rooney, who becomes her new roommate at university. In terms of what happens in this book, what I think of the story and all that, not a whole lot happens, like plot-wise. This really is about like Georgia, and we're following her at her first year at university. You know, she's making new friends, meeting new people, having new encounters, going to classes, forming like, you know, student clubs or joining student clubs for the first time, especially like acting. She's really into like the Shakespeare Society is a big thing in this. But there isn't like an overall goal we're like working towards with this story. It's really just like, you know, Georgia making her way through her first year at university, stumbling from one character interaction into another as she tries to figure out what the hell is the deal with sex and romance. So if you look this book up on my Goodreads, there is a review there for when I first read this book. And when I first read it, and also basically my opinion is still somewhat similar, is I thought this book is okay. It's not great, but it's also not terrible. Like I said, it doesn't really have that big of a plot. We're really just like following Georgia stumbling her way through a school year, like stumbling from one character interaction into another, building friendships, ruining friendships, mending friendships, all that kind of stuff. It's really mostly about like the inner life of her as she like tries to figure herself out, that, and of course she eventually realized that she is aro ace. And Georgia, unfortunately to me, was like the weakest character when I read that book, because Georgia, I mean, she is sort of written to be like this classic YA hashtag relatable, slightly shy kind of protagonist that you get in these types of books. Not offensive, but also not like super interesting. And the thing with her is that she naturally thinks a lot about, like sex and why people are so obsessed with it. Like she doesn't really understand it herself. The thing is, she's like really involved in like the online fan fiction queer community. So she's really involved in that, but somehow doesn't know about asexuality, which is a bit weird. So she's like familiar with all that queer stuff, but then when she meets other people throughout the book and talks to them, she like constantly sort of judges their romantic and sexual behavior. Like she would always judge what people are doing in regards to like sex or romance. Like she would always be like, I don't understand, why are people doing this? Oh, that's like kind of disgusting and weird. And I kind of get that. Of course, those are thoughts you have or could have as you're trying to figure yourself out. But at times, it really felt judgy that she was like constantly really like judging people for what they were doing, especially because there's this character, her new roommate Rooney, who is having a lot of like casual sex, and obviously for Georgia that's weird, and she's judging Rooney for that, especially like in the beginning. So that felt a bit off at times. Georgia also does a couple of things throughout the book that I personally don't agree with. For example, fake dating is a thing. Fake dating for her because she basically... So her friend, I think his name was Joshua. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. So he has sort of a crush on her, and she figures that out, and then dates him, even though she doesn't really like him, reciprocate his feelings. She agrees to date him to see for herself if a romantic relationship is something she is into, without telling him. And that honestly felt very, very iffy. And rightfully so. I know that's a spoiler, but I feel like I should point out, rightfully so, the character who was involved that is pissed off at her for doing that. But then again, she keeps doing stuff like that, judging people or saying stupid things, but then never really like apologizing for it. Like she feels sort of bad about it, but doesn't really like ever apologize for some of the stuff she's saying or doing, which made me go like, okay, I get what you're thinking. I guess I get why you're doing this, but it would be nice if you could really like outright acknowledge some of the shit you're actually pulling here. Some of the other character work I also didn't quite like in this novel, which isn't necessarily related to the Ace rep. Like, for example, the character of Rooney, who is like this character who enjoys a lot of casual sex, which is tied to also her like figuring out her sexuality. And I didn't like how that is then connected to like her having a tragic background story. Like, I was like, just let people enjoy casual sex. That's okay. Like, if you have a lot of sex, casual sex, and you're enjoying it and it's all consensual, good for you. Why does it need to be tied to like some weird tragic background story or something? Like, that felt a bit weird as well. So yeah, like the character work in this book, not always the greatest. In terms of the Ace rep, I do honestly appreciate what this book is doing. And I know this is also a very personal story for Alice Oseman. My one issue with this was that while I appreciate Georgia as a character and her figuring out that she's arrow ace and all that, I personally thought the book portrays her experience, like Georgia experience, a little too exclusively as the arrow ace experience. Because we never really get, unlike Is Love the Answer, we don't really get any contrast to like some other characters who might also be ace or might be figuring themselves out in that way. Because there are opportunities this book has to do that, but then doesn't really use them. For example, Georgia never really does any research about her own sexuality, and which doesn't really make sense because she says she is involved in like the queer fanfiction fandom space, but doesn't know what asexuality is and doesn't do any research into that as soon as she finds out about it. Like, she will be like, oh, and I tried looking up asexuality, but no, it's overwhelming, and then I stopped looking at it immediately, and then she never does it again. And you're like, why not? There are other characters who are there to potentially also tell about ace stuff. For example, there's this one character whose name I think is Sunil. And Sunil is introduced as, I think, a non-binary, homoromantic ace person who goes by he/they pronouns. First off, the book only refers to that character by he pronouns the whole time, which felt a bit weird. I'm like, why do you introduce them as someone with he/they pronouns and then you only ever use he, the one binary pronoun, the whole time? What's the point? Like, that felt a bit weird. And then Sunil, he is basically just there to explain shit to Georgia about asexuality. Like, they are in this book for, like, I think from what I remember, 2 or 3 scenes, as a leader of like a local queer club or something, and then they are just there to tell Georgia, like to give her a Wikipedia entry about asexuality. Like, really just that's what he's there for, and then Sunil doesn't really do anything else, which felt a bit weird. Like, that was an opportunity to talk a bit more about someone who's also ace. What's their identity? Talk about it. No, not really. There's also another character, I think Georgia's, I want to say cousin, like someone who's related to her, and she is only in the book for like 1 scene, I think, for like 1 chapter, and she talks to Georgia about that she's never really been that big into the idea of having like being married and big into romance either, and it's very clearly hinted at that she is also ace, but then the book stops there and doesn't acknowledge that character again. It doesn't talk about that she might have different experiences, what it means to be ace or possibly arrow. And the book doesn't talk about that. Like, there are opportunities to talk about the bigger ace umbrella, but then the book doesn't do it and just focuses on Georgia, who refuses to do research, and some stuff just like falls off, like doesn't get explained, even though it's very clear there. For example, Georgia is clearly written to be sex repulsed, but that word never gets mentioned or used, ever. And that's like some terminology or some important context that I think is missing if you write about ace representation, because again, it sort of plays into this that it portrays Georgia's story a little bit too exclusively as the ace experience, instead of saying, oh hey, that's just something that she's experiencing, but hey, all those other people here, all those other identities that you can have under like the ace umbrella. I totally respect if you love this book and see yourself in Georgia. Honestly, I totally get it. I know people who absolutely adore this book and who see themselves in Georgia and love the story. Honestly, totally get it. I love that for you if that's the case. Just for me, like, it hit some notes where I was thinking, nah, you could have done that better. You could have explained that a bit better. So yeah, for me personally, it was a little disappointing. I think at the time I gave this book like 3 out of 5 stars. So this book isn't terrible. Like, it is enjoyable. It's like it's a good enough our ace coming out story in a YA book, and I think we do need more books like this. It's like fun and good to see that we have books like this about ace people figuring themselves out, especially also at a younger age. I do think we need more books like that, just to be like, hey, it's okay if you feel that way, and it's okay if you're still figuring yourself out, even if you're younger, even when you're a bit older. Like, that's fine. I love that that's the message of this book, and that this book is trying to be like, hey, love and romance is not all important. What's really important is like the friendships you have in your life, and the platonic bonds are just as equally important as romantic or sexual relationships. Like, this part of like this aspect of the book is really great. This book really says friendship and platonic relationships are equally important to romantic or sexual relationships. Like, that's good. I guess if you're a bit younger, I mean, I read this when did I read this? 2 or 3 years ago, like in my mid-20s. I was maybe a tad too old for this book already. Like, if you're a bit younger, or like are really into like YA fiction, I think you get a bit more out of this than me. And if you're already like really familiar with asexuality as a theme, or you yourself have already figured yourself out for like a long time, this doesn't bring anything new to the table. This really reads more like for people who are not familiar with asexuality at all, especially not like in fiction. It sort of reads a bit more like that. I you I would argue you can't go wrong with this book. Like, it's worth checking out, but I would argue don't expect too much. And some aspects of the representation in this book, I think, needed more explanation and needed a bit more nuance. But overall, I think this is okay. I totally understand why people love this, but this wasn't like my favorite ace rep book out there. So that's it for these 3 book reviews about ace representation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts and opinions on the books I talked about, please do tell me down in the comments below. I would love to hear some discussion or get into some discussion on these books. And if you have any other recommendations for like a great ace representation, be it books, but it can also be like, I don't know, TV shows, movies, video games, whatever. Put them down in the comments below. I'm always looking out for like some new ace rep I could get into and potentially make another video about. I would love to do another video about, you know, ace guy reviews, ace books. I would love to do that again if I can get my hands on more ace representation. So again, if you have any recommendations, put them down in the comments below. And also, if you have like any other ideas for stuff like this, you know, like review 3 books of one specific genre, one specific topic. If you have any ideas, or if there's something you would like to see more of, tell me down in the comments below if you have any ideas, or if you would love to see more content like this. I had fun talking about these books, just like focusing on one specific topic. So if that's something you're interested in, tell me down in the comments below. So that's it for me. If you're interested in seeing what other books I'm reading, do follow me on Goodreads and or on Storygraph. I update all my books there, also trying to write reviews for every book I read. So you can follow me on those platforms. Links to those profiles are in the description down below. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.